Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And the 2037 to 38 offseason is finally underway. We've actually made a couple of trades here, even though it is the opening day of the offseason. We will touch upon both of those shortly. I think some will be surprising to longtime viewers and members of the Worldwide Scouting Department. Perhaps one of them will be pretty well telegraphed and expected at this point. But before we get into the trades we've made, just want to follow up on a few comments to recent episodes and how the season ended. Definitely got some suggestions that we perhaps should have been more aggressive in tweaking our lineup as our offense fell apart over the second half of the season. I get the point. We clearly went from the best offense in the American League at about the midway point of the season to, I believe, the 9th rated offense in the American League. When all was said and done, he had 9th in runs scored right there when the season came to an end. I think on the margins, probably could have done some things in retrospect, probably would have dropped Colt Keith down in the batting order a bit. Maybe just one spot, swapped him and Andy Toribio. I think that certainly could have helped us. But honestly, when I look at the team and how players performed, I don't think I would have changed too much. We basically just had, in my opinion, a lot of bad luck because when all is said and done, I'm typically going to care more about the player ratings when I have a great scout as we do today. And the player rating suggests that the three guys that were the biggest disappointments in our lineup over the second half of the season are all still really good players who just happened to get unlucky. And we had 4 everyday players who were all-stars this season in our lineup, as well as 2 pitchers. And they were our 2, 3, 4, and 5 hitters throughout most of the season. Juan Ramos, who ended up high on the American League batter leader list with 42 homers, 131 ribbies, and a 283 average, playing every single game for us for a second straight year, is the one of those 4 players who didn't have a almost historically awful second half slump. But unfortunately, our other 3 all-stars all really fell apart in the second half of the season. All-star second baseman Alejandro Landin, you can see here, hit .330 in April, dipped to .224 in May, .579 in his injury-abbreviated June, hit .304 in July. But then in August, he hit just a .190. In September, he hit just .260. So over the last 2 months of the season, he was about a .235 hitter. And that 33 WRC plus that he put up in the month of August was historically awful for a player of his caliber. And you can see over the last 2 months of the season, he was a below replacement level player for us. And Landin wasn't even the biggest drop-off that we had, unfortunately for us. Probably was Andy Brailovsky, and you can see his ratings here are still pretty solid. And as a left-handed hitter, his ratings against right-handed pitching, even better. He was a guy who, early in the year, was in the mix for a triple crown. You can see he hit .347 in April, .283 in May, and then .380 in June. And he had 14 homers and 43 ribbies as of the end of May. And then he completely fell apart in the second half of the season. 212, 225, and 243 averages in July, August, and September. And even only hit a .182 in 3 games in October. But more importantly than that, only 1 home run and 23 runs batted in over the final 3+ months of the season. Well below average offensively over the entire second half of the year. And another guy who was below replacement level for us after an outstanding first half of the year. And it was a similar tale with our number 5 hitter, Arturo Uresti. Still has above average power and that outstanding eye. Probably not going to take the 24-year-old out of the lineup. But when we look at his splits as well, it all fell apart those last couple months of the season. Hit 234 in August and a .179 in September. And only a combined 5 home runs and 19 ribbies over August, September, and October. He still actually managed to be a bit above replacement level over those last 2+ months of the season. But given the big start he had to this season when he put up a 3.7 WAR over the first 3 months of the season, the first 4 months of the season, if I could add, being barely above replacement level over the last 2 months of the year when the team was spiraling out of first place to become a team that was fighting for its playoff life as the end of the regular season approached. Uresti was also disappointing as well. There was a suggestion to move Toribio up for Landin. I think, that possibly could have helped us in the second half of the year. Although when you look at their numbers for the year, even with Landin's slump, they're pretty similar. So I think there's certainly things I could have tweaked on the margin. Honestly, Sergio Palomares actually slowed down a little bit in the second half of the year as well. 400 average in April, 300 in May, 275 in June. Did also hit 291 in August, but only 215 in July and 221 in September. And those were the months when he was playing a lot more after the injury to Jake Ortega. So I think ultimately second half slumps by a lot of our key players, and the fact that the best all-around hitter on our team, Jake Ortega, also ended up missing the last 3.5 months of the season are what doomed this offense. But when I look at the player ratings and the fact we're going to have most of these guys back next year, if we want to, I'm not all that concerned. I think it was just a lot of bad luck for several players that kind of hit at the same time. And another lineup topic that's gotten some attention, not just, to be honest, in recent episodes, but actually over the past few seasons, has been my decisions at catcher, where we've gone with Dave Ackley more often than not as our starter. You can see he started the majority of games for us each of the last 3 years, and he certainly has not been great offensively, with a 75 career WRC plus and an average of a 1 WAR for every 162 games that he's played. And the man who was our starter at catcher before Ackley came up, Jaden Boakai, is a guy that several viewers have kind of consistently insisted I should put into the starting lineup. And technically, their point that Boakai is better offensively is true. He's got a 78 WRC plus over the course of his career, so he is slightly better offensively than Ackley has been. And you can see he has put up a 2 WAR for every 162 games that he's played. So he's definitely been a better player. But honestly, I think the argument that we should be playing Boakai because of his excellent defense instead of Ackley, who is still solid defensively but not quite as good, is probably more compelling to me than the argument that we should be playing Boakai because of his offense. That being said, we've got Ackley signed for this upcoming season at $4 million, whereas Boakai, who's arbitration eligible, is set to make around $6 million next year. So as much as I love these two defensively, $10 million, which is going to be close to 10% of our likely payroll when all is said and done, might be a little bit high, and we may have to move on from one or the other. But it's not inconceivable that we could bring back both Ackley and Boakai, and if we do bring them both back next year, I think it's conceivable that we will play Boakai more, given that he'll be making more money, and although neither is proven to be a particularly adept major league hitter over the course of their careers, Boakai is clearly better with his defensive ratings, although Ackley is still a very sound defensive catcher. That was the other thing that I did look at, fielding statistics from this past year. We had a 3.48 catcher ERA from Mr. Ackley. And when we look at Mr. Boakai with the exact same pitching staff, his catcher ERA this year was 3.82. So not a huge difference there, but it certainly favors Ackley, which is a bit surprising. Over the course of their careers, Boakai at 384, which I believe is a little bit better than Ackley over the course of their careers, where he's 3.91, basically with the same pitching staff. So I think, as I talked about with some of the hitters, I ultimately base my decisions based on ratings when I've got very high scouting accuracy and a very good scout, which we do have with these guys. And although the catcher ERA over the years suggests that they're pretty similar in terms of how the pitchers ultimately perform with them, Boakai's ratings are certainly better across the board defensively, so all else being equal, I should probably go with him. Don't necessarily think that that lineup decision was another one that would have saved us from this free fall that had us into July with the best record in baseball and a big lead in the division, and then we subsequently really fell apart over those last couple months of the season. But in retrospect, dropping Keith in the order, maybe moving Toribio up to second, and giving more playing time to Boakai over Ackley at catcher would all be things that could have helped us. But given that, again, 3 of our 4 All-Stars and arguably 4 of the 5 best hitters on our team underperformed over that second half of the year, I do feel like, to an extent, making a bunch of changes to the batting order would have really just been rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, unfortunately. And a third topic that I've mentioned before and that's also been discussed in response to recent episodes is what to do with Jackson Ferris. Our longtime ace had another solid year for us, 13-8, 3.52 ERA, and a 3.2 WAR. But he's set to make $24 million next year at the age of 34. He's fragile physically, although fortunately, as we talked about in our season recap episode, through a pitch count and a quick hook, he's pitched at least 31 games for us every year that he's been with us, which is now 9 seasons. And this past year was the first time he didn't qualify for the ERA title, as he did miss a couple of games with injury. But Ferris also became a 10-5 guy with us this past year, since we were looking for a repeat. We didn't want to trade him before those 10-5 rights vested. But although he's on the trade block, right now he's not willing to waive the no-trade clause. We can just barely bring him back next year at that number without it having a huge negative impact on our budget. And as we'll talk about shortly, we've also made a couple of trades, which on balance have freed up a little more money for us as well. And we've also got a couple of guys with team options that we can and likely will be potentially moving on from. So it's not the end of the world if we can't trade Ferris. And if we do bring him back, having a rotation of Ferris, Dora, likely Rookie of the Year Jesus Saldana, who just led the American League with a 1.95 ERA. Finally, and I know many of you have been waiting for this for a year and a half now, giving Doug Weiss an opportunity in the rotation after he had a fantastic year for us as a stopper, and then dropping Kevin Patterson down to the 5 spot in the rotation potentially gives us what I believe is deep a rotation as you could hope to have in the game. I don't know that Saldana, who's probably the most talented pitcher that we're going to have, although Weiss is similar at least in terms of the star rating, I don't know if those two are going to be as dominant at the top of the rotation as the pitchers some teams may be throwing out there. But 1 to 5, I think that Ferris, Dora, Saldana, Weiss, and Patterson could be an outstanding rotation for us next year. So although we think we've got the money to basically bring back everyone on our team from last year if we wanted to, and given that this is still one of the best teams in baseball, we'd happily bring back just about everybody and feel like we could certainly compete for a title again next year. We have made a couple of trades and definitely recognize that the lineup is not perfect and the pitching situation is not perfect, so we've done a couple of deals that we think will address that. The first, and I don't think this is going to surprise many people, is that we have dealt the outfielder Luis Taveras away. He's another guy who's been a popular topic of discussion in the comment section from our loyal viewers over the past couple of years. Taveras is a guy that I have typically started only against left-handed pitching. He's got very even offensive ratings against lefties and righties. A little bit better contact hitter against lefties, to be fair. He's put up a 116 WRC plus over the course of parts of 6 seasons with us in Oakland. And even though he's a right-handed hitter with better ratings against left-handed pitching, he's got a 107 WRC plus against lefties over the course of his career versus a 125 WRC plus over righties. So seems like a guy who, in terms of his performance, the reverse splits apply for. He's averaged about 270 at-bats a year for us for the last 4 seasons. You can see typically started 60 to 75 games a year. And given that, particularly over the last season and a half, our outfield has gone from being a weakness to a strength, I've just never given him an everyday opportunity, despite the very good reminders from viewers over the last few years that this is a pretty good fictional ball player who's hit very well in general and even better than expected against right-handed pitching, and we should have given a bigger shot to him. So I don't love that we're moving on from him, but he is a guy who was expected to make about $6 million in arbitration. I don't know exactly what the Cubs have offered him at this point. But he was going to be an expensive guy for us, for a player that I still did not intend to start in the outfield, given that we potentially have Ortega coming back in center field, Uresti in right field, and likely Palomares or Brailovsky in left field if we don't move Brailovsky back to first base. So $6 million for a guy who was a 4th outfielder, was willing to trade him away because he did have some trade value. We also included 24-year-old minor league reliever Joey Stephan. The lack of control, I think, is going to be a huge limiting factor on his career. He only has made it to high A with us, so he was a throw-in. The guy who was a bit more valuable that we had to include was a 23-year-old second baseman, Dan Nolan. He's a guy we drafted several years ago. Hadn't made it higher than A-ball, but he was very effective when he played this year in A-ball. But looking at his batting profile and his defensive profile, I didn't view him as anything more than a potential utility infielder for us. So we hadn't been investing very heavily in him over the years. And including Nolan and Stephan with Taveras allowed me to make an offer that I just couldn't say no to. Normally, with the trade settings that we're playing on, it seems very hard to find a deal that I'm willing to do most times, and almost impossible to ever find a deal that I love. But this is one of those once or twice a decade deals that I just love. We got the 26-year-old left fielder Mike Alanis in return. He is a guy who is still making the major league minimum next year, even though he's spent 2.5 years in the majors. And he's put up a 132 WRC plus over the course of his career. So he is younger than Taveras. He's been a better offensive player than Taveras. He's better defensively, I think, with that 65 range than Taveras. And he's proven to be a better offensive player in terms of his performance than Taveras. He's a guy who hit 25 homers last season, and given that the only guy on our team who had more than 17 homers was our cleanup hitter Ramos, I think adding in Alanis, who's averaged 29 homers over his 2 full seasons in the majors, will give our offense a nice boost. I was just talking about left field not that long ago. Presumably if Alanis goes into that position, then if we do bring back Andy Brailovsky, we move him back to first base where he was before we reunited with Colt Keith. The only disappointing thing is this probably pushes the young outfielder Sergio Palomares into more of a 4th outfielder role, because clearly Ramos is going to be back in the DH spot. But when I looked at this trade, I don't think Alanis is a superstar, but he is a very good player. Good bat, good glove, good in the clubhouse, good speed, even though it doesn't seem like the Cubs have really utilized it with him stealing only 11 bases and being caught 7 times over the course of his career. But looking at the speed he has and his stealing ability and aggressiveness, I think we can certainly get much more out of him on the base paths. So, feel kind of bad that Taveras, a guy who came up through our organization, we probably never really gave him a fair shot and a full opportunity. Nolan may prove to be a useful player. I don't think Stefan is going to prove to be all that useful. But to me, this was a slam dunk trade when I did do a player search for outfielders who were above average in terms of their contact, power, and eye. Clearly, Alanis met that criteria, and of the players who were available, the price for him was by far the most reasonable. And as I said, we're going to be saving some money next year, getting a close to $6 million contract off the books, which will give us more money to put into scouting and player development. And we've also added a big-time bat into our lineup for next season to hopefully help reignite this offense when Jake Ortega is back in the fold as well. And with the money that he was going to make and the lack of opportunities I've given to him and the way I've spoken about Taveras in episodes and in the comment section, I don't think those of you who follow us closely are going to be surprised that he's gone. The other trade, maybe a bit more surprising, but I'm sure some of you will be very happy with it. Camden Reisinger, the difficult personality who we brought on last year to be our closer, signed him to a 1-year deal as he was a free agent, but because of his lack of major league service time, he is actually arbitration eligible for us this year, set to make about $3 million, and it will now be with one of our key rivals, the Los Angeles Angels, that he'll be doing that. Reisinger, a 3.88 ERA, 29 saves for us, just a bit above replacement. Didn't perform as well as I had hoped. Had that disruptive influence in the clubhouse that always bothered me. And I know there's several of you out there, most notably our contingent of scouts in Great Britain, that were very down on Mr. Reisinger in general. But we were able to trade Mr. Reisinger along with a few other players. Ian Dunn, who's basically a 4A kind of pitcher. We've had him in the minors for the last couple seasons. Happy to include him. Danny Augustine is a solid infielder, or a solid outfielder, but not a serious prospect for us. I mean, he hit 300 with 22 homers and 78 ribbies in AAA, 118 WRC plus. And his batting profile honestly doesn't look materially different than Taveras, who we were just talking about, although he's not as good as Taveras defensively. But with the strength that we have at outfield, even though Augustine is probably a good solid 4th or 5th outfielder, he was not someone who was going to get much time with us, so we were content to include him. And then another minor league outfielder, John Danico, guy who did really well in a brief stint in A-ball for us this year before we promoted him to high A, where he was not great, hitting just .210, although he did have 12 homers and 252 at-bats. But don't view Danico as a really big-time prospect. So I think Reisinger, Augustine, and then to a lesser extent Danico were the valuable players that we passed along. But we got a 26-year-old reliever, Mike Orozco, in return. Now, Orozco is a guy who is arbitration eligible and going to be making close to $6 million next year. So this is a transaction that's actually going to cost us money because he's going to be making $2.5 to $3 million more than Reisinger will next year. He's fragile physically, which I don't love. He's not too bright, which I don't love. But he is a reliever with good stamina and a potential 4-pitch arsenal. So he could probably start for us in a pinch. But with that really good stamina, above average stuff, above average control, and even movement that we think is a bit above average, he's been a really good pitcher over the course of his career, even a bit better than Reisinger. And I think that if we end up moving Weiss into the rotation as we plan to, Orozco is a guy who could either take over as closer for Reisinger or potentially, with that stamina, serve in a setup role and fill in for Weiss for us if we decide to let one of our young prospect relief arms try to be our closer next year. So I think Reisinger is better in the clubhouse. I think Orozco is better in the clubhouse than Reisinger, and I think Orozco is a slightly better pitcher than Reisinger. I don't love the fragility, and I don't love the fact that he's going to cost us a little bit more than Reisinger would have in terms of the payroll. But with the money we took off the books in the Taveras to Alanis swap, I think it ultimately made sense to extract the value that we got by signing Reisinger as a free agent, since he was now a member of our organization for the next couple years till he reached his free agency based on service time rather than just being waived and DFA'd. Or more accurately, I think actually released. And I think we got a small upgrade to our pitching staff with Mr. Orozco on board. Just wish he was a lefty. But Mike Orozco, born in 2011, perhaps Jesse Orozco's grandson. So with the money freed up by the moves that we've made, we're able to put a little bit more into scouting and player development, but the hope is that we'll still save some more money over this arbitration period and with the team options that we need to decide on in relatively short order. So I think we are potentially going to have the money to bring Mr. Ferris back next year, which, given that he doesn't seem willing to waive his no-trade clause right now, might be necessary. I don't want to say the most important thing, but a very important thing that I hadn't mentioned is that Mr. Orozco was also an extremely popular player, and that gave us a 4-point boost from the 81 fan interest that we finished last season with up to the 85 that we are right now. So that was another deal, another factor that, in my mind, made the swap of Reisinger for Orozco even more compelling to do. So thinking about salary arbitration, there's only one decision that I'm still not sure of at this point, and it's the catcher, Jaden Boakai. But we're going to try to bring back Garland, Cope, and O'Banner to be members of the pitching staff. O'Banner definitely getting expensive for what he is, with a $6 million arbitration estimate. But he is a solid reliever who can start for us in a pinch. Garland also a guy who can start, and he's really cheap. And Cope has been a pretty good lefty for us for the last few years out of the bullpen. We're going to bring Rodney Mesidor back to compete for a third base or utility infielder spot. Juan Ramos has been our best offensive player, honestly, over the last 2 years at this point, given that we missed out on most of Jake Ortega for the second half of this season. And you can see that Ramos averaging close to 40 home runs and close to 140 ribbies in his 2 seasons in Oakland has been incredibly valuable for us, so we're going to bring him back. Andy Brailovsky, I think, is one that some viewers have suggested we should move on from. I get that he fell apart in the second half of the year, but when I look at his ratings, particularly against right-handed pitching, I think he can have a bounce-back season for us next year. I think he'll also be a more valuable player for us overall when he's playing first base. His range and his arm in the outfield were both well below average. Not necessarily a dynamic first baseman, but with his 6'2" height, he's a better first baseman defensively than he is a left fielder at this point. So that'll make him, I don't want to say it'll necessarily make him more valuable, but it'll be better for the team because we'll, of course, have Alanis in left field instead, the new addition, who will be much better defensively. And then Brailovsky will be better defensively at first base than the aging Colt Keith was. And a big part of the reason that I'm going to bring back Brailovsky is that with the move that we've now made to bring on the right-handed hitting Alanis and the fact that we're going to be moving on from the left-handed hitting Colt Keith, basically, other than our cleanup hitter Juan Ramos, Brailovsky is the only other left-handed hitter that we have on the major league squad at this point. And I would rather go with the guy that we know than take a risk of hoping on an international free agent or a borderline major league free agent. Now, to be fair, with the switch hitting Landine, the switch hitting Dolan, and the switch hitting Colt Keith, presuming that he returns at close to 100%, we do have other guys to kind of mix into the lineup against right-handed pitching who will hit left-handed against them, but didn't want to only be in a situation where we only had one left-handed bat in the lineup. So we've decided to bring back Brailovsky, and we've still got a big decision to make on Jaden Boakai. The other big decisions we have to make are our option years. Jason DeCaro set to make $6.5 million. He has really regressed last year. His ERA almost doubled to 7, was well below replacement level. We'll miss that captain personality, but it's $6.5 million for a guy who is definitely not going to be in our rotation next year unless we have a bunch of injuries. I think it's time to move on from him. Chris Carl, left-handed reliever, is a similar story. He was a marginal roster guy for us this year, and we took advantage of the fact that he still had some options to have him in Las Vegas. But he's 28 years old. He's wrecked physically, and we've got a team option for $4 million for him. So even with the buyouts that we have to pay for these guys, if we move on from DeCaro and Carl, that is going to free up close to another $10 million off our payroll, push us closer to $125 million in payroll, and it'll also potentially give us a little more money available to bring on guys, although they're not going to be impact guys. But more importantly, we can bolster scouting, player development, and the draft budget back towards the levels that we've gotten familiar to them being at over the past few years. So the big question to me at this point is, do we go with the Boakai and Ackley tandem at catcher for a fourth straight year? Perhaps finally listening to viewer advice and giving more playing time to Boakai? Or do we move on from a Boakai or an Ackley to free up another $4 to $6 million and potentially give Juan Anguiano, who is now out of options, an opportunity to play in the majors next year? He's also a solid defensive catcher with a good arm. I think his bat is likely to be a bit worse than either Ackley or Boakai, but if I'm willing to just turn the job over to one of those players, I think I could do worse as a backup catcher than Anguiano. And that, as I talked about, if we did move on from Ackley or Boakai, bring Anguiano up, that'll free another $4 or $5, $6 million in the budget. Allow us to maybe invest more in scouting and development in the draft budget, which we're going to need to do, or potentially be more active in free agency. When we take a look at the free agents and the catchers that are out there, not anyone that interesting right now, but the upcoming free agent pool is a little more interesting potentially. Not going to have the money to go after Caleb Loma Vida, unfortunately, because would love to have that captain personality involved. But Jacob Cozart is marginally interesting to me. Supposedly he's going to be looking for about $2.5 million. He's going to be 35 years old and he's fragile physically, but a respectable looking major league bat, a respectable glove, 78 WRC plus over the course of his career, so he's lived right in the same neighborhood as Ackley and Boakai. But at $2.5 million-ish, he'd be cheaper than either of those guys. So would love to hear from the Worldwide Scouting Department whether they think we should go with Ackley and Boakai again next year, or perhaps move on from one of those guys and maybe replace him with Cozart, or maybe just promote Juan Anguiano to the major league team. And the last thing we'll check in on before we finish up this episode, and I promise next time around we will start moving forward, is our preliminary plan for the Player Development Lab. Chuck Huntley, the young reliever, and Jonathan Scherer, another young reliever, are working on secondary pitch improvement. The brilliant young pitcher, Trey Saldana, only has a 40 stamina. The one thing we think we could do with him to potentially make him even more valuable is to stretch him out, so he's going to be doing endurance training. And then three of our top young players in the organization, Alcindor, the third baseman, Big Baby Dolan, and Arturo Uresti, are all going to be working on the somewhat difficult program to improve their power by generating more bat speed. Doug Weiss and Daniel Blanco going to be working on secondary pitch improvement, prospect center fielder Harmon, quality of contact. Danny Phelps, who we picked up in a trade, I believe it was with with the Red Sox right at the end of the spring. Who did we trade away? It was one of those, Juan Lovato, that's right, the outfielder that we had picked up a little bit earlier. Danny Phelps spent the year in the minors for us, but still has a profile at the age of closing in on 25 that is probably interesting for a fourth or fifth outfielder, particularly with that left-handed bat. So we're going to give Phelps an opportunity to work on his power. Juan Ramos, maybe he can get more walks. Darnell Selvey, former first-round pick, working on bat speed. Blumenshine, our first-round pick from 2036, working on his pitch movement. Another college pitcher who was our first-round pick this year, Sourface Jensen, going to work on his control. Luis Godina, I believe the highest-rated prospect in our organization, going to work on his contact. Jorge Castillo, plate discipline. Gravedigger Palomares, plate discipline. Flea Landy, plate discipline. And then Bobby Garland and Fish Patterson, both going to work on secondary pitch improvement. The only other thing that I'm really thinking about right now is whether we should swap out one of these programs and get our new reliever, Mr. Orozco, into a program, maybe to work on secondary pitch improvement, maybe movement in general. But at 26 years old, I think there's still a chance that he could have a successful program for us. And given that we've just made a big trade to bring him on board, that is something to consider as well. And honestly, similarly, Alanis is another guy that we're going to need to think about maybe swapping out somebody for. We still think his home run power could get a little better. Maybe his contact a little better with a higher BABIP rating. So there's things that he could work on as well. So that is something I'm going to spend some time thinking about between now and the next episode, whether the two guys that we recently traded for are worthy of one of our precious spots in the development lab. I think I could argue that Landine, 27 years old, we think his eye can get a little better, but maybe that's not the biggest leverage play that we can make. Could also argue that one of the real young prospects in our system, maybe we pull them out of the development lab and invest a little bit more this off-season in some guys who are going to be certainly helping us this season, we hope, in Alanis and Orozco. So still a lot of things for me to think about. If you have thoughts on what we should do in the development lab, what we should do with our situation at catcher, or what we should do with anything else on the team, would love to hear them in the comment section. And if you've got thoughts on the trades that we've already made and some of the other decisions that we've already made at the start of this episode, always helpful to get that feedback. Even though the die has been cast on those things, always interesting to hear different perspectives. And as I said, I promise we will actually start moving forward in the next episode, but there's so many things I've been thinking about and working on offline over the last couple of days in real time. Felt like we had enough content to just kind of review my responses to some recent feedback, the initial moves that I've made at the start of this off-season, and a little more nuanced view on what I'm thinking of possibly doing going forward. So until that next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.